Hello, everyone. So let me tell you what's actually happening right now, because if you're getting your news from mainstream American outlets, you're missing the entire story. While Donald Trump has been screaming about tariffs, threatening Canada, and pounding his chest on True Social about how he's going to bring Canada to its knees economically, something remarkable has been unfolding north of the border. And it's not what Trump expected. It's not what his advisors predicted. And it's certainly not what he's been telling his supporters. Canada's economy just posted numbers that have economists in Washington scrambling to rewrite their projections. While Trump's tariff threats were supposed to crater the Canadian dollar, send Canadian businesses fleeing south, and prove once and for all that Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada. The exact opposite is happening, and Mark Carney saw this coming from a mile away. Let me walk you through the numbers that came out just this week, numbers that the American media is conveniently ignoring. Canadian inflation dropped in February, not held steady, not increased slightly, dropped. This is happening while the American economy is dealing with inflation pressures that Trump's own policies are making worse. The Iran war that he escalated, then said he'd wind down, then escalated again, is sending energy prices haywire. His tariff threats are creating supply chain chaos that's hitting American consumers directly in their wallets. And yet, Canada's inflation is going down. You might be asking yourself, how is that possible? How is it possible that while Trump is wielding tariffs like a weapon, Canada's economy is actually stabilizing? This is where Mark Carney's master plan comes into focus. And trust me, this is something they did not teach at whatever business school Trump claims he attended. Mark Carney understood something fundamental that the Trump administration, in all their bluster and America First rhetoric, completely missed. When you threaten a trading partner, when you treat them like an adversary instead of an ally, you don't just change trade flows. You change behavior, you change priorities, and you change entire economic strategies. Carney responded by doing something brilliant. Instead of panicking, instead of rushing to appease Trump, instead of offering concessions, he doubled down on Canadian sovereignty. He began pivoting Canada's economic strategy away from total dependence on American markets. He strengthened ties with other trading partners, invested in domestic infrastructure focused on housing, and worked to build Canadian resilience from within. The nomination of Annette Ryan as Parliamentary Budget Officer this week is actually a key piece of this puzzle. Canadian Conservatives and the Bloc are raising concerns about whether she'll be independent enough from Carney's government. But here's what they're really worried about. They're worried that Carney is going to use the PBO to validate massive public spending on infrastructure, on housing, and on the kinds of nation-building projects that will insulate Canada from American economic warfare, because that's what this is. Let's call it what it is. Trump's tariff threats aren't trade policy. They're economic warfare against America's closest ally, against a country that shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States, against a country that has fought alongside American soldiers in virtually every conflict for the past century. And Carney looked at that reality and said, fine, if that's how you want to play it, we'll build an economy that doesn't need you as much as you think we do. Think about the timing. Trump announces tariff threats. American media runs with the narrative that Canada will crumble. But what actually happens? The Bank of Canada holds interest rates steady. They're not panicking. They're not slashing rates to try to prop up their economy in the face of American pressure. They're maintaining their position because they see something Trump doesn't. An economy that's actually in a stronger position than the narrative suggests. Let's dig into what's really happening with these numbers, because this is where it gets fascinating. Global share markets took a hit this week. That's being reported everywhere. But what's not being reported is why Canadian markets are holding steadier than American analysts predicted. What's not being reported is that Canadian businesses are already adapting to a post-Trump tantrum world. Canadian exporters have been diversifying for months. They saw this coming. When Trump started his first round of tariff threats, Canadian business leaders didn't sit around waiting for American politicians to save them. They started exploring markets in Asia, Europe, and South America. And those relationships are now paying dividends. The inflation drop in February is particularly telling because it happened despite global energy volatility stemming from the Iran war. That war, which Trump keeps flip-flopping on, changing his mind about whether to wind down or escalate, is creating enormous pressure on global oil prices. Canada is an energy exporter, so you'd expect that volatility to flow directly into Canadian inflation numbers. But it didn't. Why? Because Carney's government has been managing the economy with actual competence instead of Twitter tantrums. And here's the thing that's really going to bother Trump when his advisors finally explain it to him in small enough words. Canada's economic resilience is making his tariff threats look impotent. Every day that goes by where Canada doesn't collapse, where Canadian businesses don't come crawling back begging for mercy, is another day that proves Trump's entire economic worldview is based on outdated assumptions and ego rather than reality. Trump built his entire political brand on the idea that he's a master negotiator, that he wrote the art of the deal, that he can bully anyone into submission. And Mark Carney is quietly, methodically proving that doesn't work when you're dealing with a competent government that actually understands modern economics. Now let's talk about what Carney's doing with housing and infrastructure, because this is a long game that Trump's short attention span can't possibly comprehend. The concerns being raised about the parliamentary budget officer nomination aren't really about Annette Ryan as an individual. They're about what her appointment signals about the scale of public investment Carney is planning. Carney is looking at a Canada that needs massive housing construction, infrastructure upgrades, and the kind of economic resilience required for a world where the United States is no longer a reliable partner. And he's preparing to open the public purse to make that happen. This isn't typical government spending. This is economic nation building on a scale we haven't seen in generations. Think about what that means in practical terms. Every dollar Canada invests in domestic housing is a dollar that circulates in the Canadian economy. It employs Canadian workers, uses Canadian materials where possible, and builds Canadian cities and communities. It's not dependent on whether Donald Trump wakes up in a good mood or decides to send another unhinged post about tariffs. Every infrastructure project Carney greenlights is another piece of economic independence from American whims. Better ports mean better access to Asian markets. Better rail means more efficient domestic distribution. Better telecommunications mean Canadian tech companies can compete globally without routing everything through Silicon Valley. And here's the beautiful irony that Trump will never understand. By threatening Canada, by treating Canada like an enemy, Trump has actually done Carney a favor. He's given him the political justification to make these investments. He's given him the ability to go to the Canadian public and say, look, we can't depend on the Americans anymore. We need to build our own strength. And the Canadian public watching Trump's behavior is largely agreeing. Do you think Canadians want to be dependent on a country led by someone who insults them, threatens them, and treats them with contempt? Trump has handed Carney the political capital to reshape Canada's economy, and Carney is taking full advantage. But let's bring this back across the border for a moment, because American workers need to understand what's happening here. Trump sold his tariff policy as protecting American jobs. America first, right? But what's actually happening is that he's alienating America's closest trading partner and biggest customer for American exports. Canada buys more American goods than any other country. Canadian consumers have historically preferred American products. Canadian businesses have integrated supply chains with American companies. All of that is now under threat, not because Canada wanted it that way, but because Trump decided to pick a fight he doesn't know how to finish. As Canada diversifies away from American dependence, as Canadian consumers start buying from other countries, and as Canadian businesses build relationships with non-American suppliers, those are American jobs that disappear. Those are American factories that lose contracts. Those are American communities that suffer. Trump doesn't understand this because he doesn't understand basic economics. He thinks tariffs are paid by other countries. He thinks threatening allies makes them respect you. He thinks economic relationships are zero-sum games where someone has to lose. And while he's operating on that level of understanding, Mark Carney is playing three-dimensional chess. The Canadian economy thriving despite Trump's threats isn't just a Canadian story. It's an American story about failed leadership. It's a story about what happens when you elect someone who doesn't understand that in the modern global economy, cooperation creates wealth and confrontation destroys it. Every Canadian dollar that once bought American products but now buys European or Asian products instead represents a permanent shift. Those market relationships don't just snap back because Trump eventually leaves office. Canada is learning right now that it can survive and thrive without depending on American markets as much as it used to. And once that lesson is learned, once those new supply chains are established, they're not coming back. We also need to talk about how the Iran war is playing into all of this, because it's not a coincidence that these economic tensions are unfolding simultaneously. Trump's completely incoherent Iran policy escalating, then talking about winding down, then escalating again, is creating exactly the kind of global instability that benefits Canada's pivot strategy. When energy markets are volatile because of American military adventurism, it actually strengthens Canada's position as a stable energy supplier. European countries looking for alternatives to Middle Eastern oil become more interested in Canadian energy. Asian markets looking for reliable partners become more willing to negotiate with Ottawa instead of waiting for whatever chaos Washington generates next. Trump thought the Iran war would make him look strong. He thought it would rally support. But what it's actually doing is highlighting American unpredictability, showing the world that the United States under Trump cannot be counted on for consistent, rational policy. And countries like Canada are responding by building systems that don't require American consistency. The fact that Canadian inflation dropped despite energy market volatility from the Iran war demonstrates sophisticated economic management. It shows a government that can navigate global crisis without creating new ones. Exactly the kind of steady leadership that Trump's America is completely lacking. And here's what should really worry Americans. Other countries are watching this. They're watching Canada successfully stand up to Trump's bullying. They're watching Canada's economy remain stable despite American threats. And they're learning that maybe they don't need to cave to American pressure either. Maybe they can build their own resilience. Maybe they can find their own paths. Trump is accidentally teaching the world how to build economies that don't need America as much. That's his legacy. That's what America First actually accomplished. Now, the fact that Canadian conservatives in the Bloc Québécois are raising concerns about Carney's approach is actually evidence of how significant his strategy is. They're not arguing that his plan won't work. They're arguing about oversight, about influence, about the scale of public spending he's preparing to unleash. That means they recognize this is real. This isn't symbolic. Carney is preparing to fundamentally restructure how Canada's economy operates, and even his political opponents understand the magnitude of what he's attempting. Their concerns about the parliamentary budget officer are really concerns about whether they'll have any ability to slow down or redirect what Carney is planning. And think about what that means for Trump's strategy. Trump thought his tariff threats would create chaos in Canada, that Canadian politicians would turn on each other, desperately trying to figure out how to appease him. Instead, the debate in Canada is about how best to implement economic independence from the United States. The debate is about how much public spending to deploy, not whether to deploy it. The debate is about the details of Canada's pivot away from American dependence, not whether that pivot should happen. Trump unified Canada against him. He gave Canadian politicians of different parties a common cause. He made Canadian economic sovereignty a winning political issue. You cannot buy that kind of political gift. And Trump handed it to Carney for free. So where does this go from here? Because we're at a critical juncture, and the decisions made in the next few months are going to shape North American economics for a generation. Carney is going to move forward with massive public investment. The parliamentary budget officer situation will get resolved one way or another. Either Carney gets the validation he wants for his spending plans, or he finds another way to fund them. Either way, Canadian infrastructure and housing projects are going to start breaking ground, and Canadian economic diversification is going to accelerate. Trump is going to keep threatening tariffs. He might even implement some. But every time he does, he's going to find that the impact is less than he expected. He's going to find that Canada has alternatives he didn't anticipate, that his leverage is diminishing, not increasing, and American businesses are going to start feeling the pain. Companies that depend on Canadian resources will find their costs increasing. Companies that export to Canada will find their market share shrinking. American workers are going to start asking why their jobs are suffering because of Trump's ego. The economic data is going to keep coming in, and it's going to keep showing the same pattern. Canada adjusting, adapting, surviving, and in many cases thriving. While American consumers pay more because of tariffs and American exporters lose market share, the gap between Trump's promises and reality will keep growing wider. And this brings us to the core of why this story matters so much. Trump's entire identity is built on being a winner, on making deals, on dominating negotiations, and Mark Carney is exposing that as a fraud. Trump can't acknowledge that his candidate strategy is failing because that would require admitting he was wrong. It would require admitting that bullying doesn't work against competent opponents. It would require admitting that his understanding of economics is shallow and outdated. And Trump's psychology won't allow any of that. So instead, he's going to keep doubling down. He's going to keep insisting that Canada is on the verge of collapse, that any day now they'll come begging, that his tariffs are working exactly as planned. And every day that passes where that doesn't happen is another day of humiliation he can't process or admit.